couple of very brief preliminary comments. One is that there's an American TV show that has the occasional interruption that says, and now for something completely different.
That's
well,
a British show.
That's what?
It's a British show.
Perhaps there are several. I'm thinking of John Oliver. Okay, and the other thing I wanted to say about this is a world premiere. There's a book that is currently emerging from non-being, as Nelson Goodman once said. And this is my first attempt publicly to talk a little bit about it. So it's very rough. It's very controversial. And the other thing I should warn you about is for those of you who know my work, you won't be at all surprised. It's also very long. So I'm glad we're getting started early. Okay, so there was one picture of the title, Can We Naturalize All the Way Down? This is the picture of Mario you've seen 4 or 5 times before, but I have more. Mario has, as we all know at this point, written an impressive collection of books and articles, and a central theme in his work has been philosophical naturalism. So there is philosophical naturalism. Indeed, I used to think that Mario was a philosophical naturalist. But in a recent email, when we were corresponding about what should I present at this conference, he wrote, well, I'm not sure whether I'd describe myself as a naturalist. It depends on what you mean by naturalism. At any rate, he continued, I don't think I'd naturalize all the way down. Okay. Well, though he wouldn't go all the way down, Mario has certainly explored naturalism and naturalistic approaches to philosophy along many different lines with many different strategies. One of these strategies has been undertaking empirical work addressed at philosophical issues. And I was delighted to see in preparing for the talk, I took a look at Google Scholar, and I was delighted to see that some of Mario's most frequently cited papers were in fact empirical studies in which he collaborated with me and with dozens of other researchers, some of whom are, slides say probably, I should have, some of whom are definitely in this room at the moment. Here's the relevant page. I think it was the 3 of the 4 top items on his Google Scholar page were these collective works. Well, in thinking about what should I talk about at this conference celebrating Mario's career, my first thought, not surprisingly, was to talk about some of Mario's work as an empirical explorer, that kind of naturalism. There's Mario as... I warned you I had a whole bunch of these, didn't I? So that was my first thought. But on reflection, I decided against that plan for a number of reasons. First of all, many of you already know about that work. Indeed, some of you were collaborators on those projects. So it seemed somehow inappropriate to tell you about Mario's work by telling you about your own work. And in addition to that, I spent many hours discussing this work the last time I was here in Urbino for the 2017 Summer Institute. So with your permission, this has all been a long prolegomena to where I'm going and how dare I do this. With your permission, I'd like to talk about another area in which naturalistic methods are being used to address philosophical issues. It's an area where I suspect Mario might be reluctant to go all the way down using naturalistic methods to draw conclusions about philosophical issues. But Since, as many of you know, certainly Mario knows, he's known me for decades, I'm much less prudent than he is. I'm inclined to follow the naturalistic argument all the way down. So we're going to go all the way down with it to a fairly radical conclusion. That's where I'm going to end up. But I should alert you that the bulk of the talk is going to be to try to convince you of something which I think is much easier to make a case for. And then just the last few minutes, I'll say, well, all right, if we've made a case for that, what should we conclude about the bigger philosophical issues? That's where I'm prepared to embrace and will embrace a fairly, or at least urge, these are early days yet for this project, urge a fairly radical conclusion. Okay, well, the work I want to talk about is the cognitive science of moral judgment. And there's been an enormous amount of work in the cognitive science of moral judgment for the last 25 years. Many audiences I talk to are chock-a-block with people doing this. My guess is that this audience is not all that conversant with it, but let me show you, you now know that I like Google Scholar. Let me show you the Google Scholar page here. I just, is this going to work or am I going to, yeah, no. I just typed in the cognitive science of moral judgment, and this was a month or two ago, and notice that what we get is there have been 917,000 publications in the cognitive science of moral judgment. I'm not going to talk about all of it. You're happy with it today. Okay. Well, the remedy for the problem that I'll discuss is, I think, best provided by the sort of empirically informed philosophical critique that characterizes much of Mario's work. The problem besetting this work in the cognitive science of moral judgment is what I've taken to calling the Tower of Babel problem. So my first job is to tell you what the Tower of Babel problem is, okay? The Tower of Babel problem arises when researchers in one field or several neighboring fields use a single term with a variety of importantly different meanings and notably different extensions. And the Tower of Babel problem is exacerbated, it's made more serious when, as is often the case, researchers are less than clear and less than explicit about their explanations of the term. So we have to reconstruct the intended definition from the procedures they use and the tests they use and the methodologies they use. When this happens, the literature is often marred by arguments that look like the one depicted below. The participants simply don't understand one another. I like that image, but I like this one even better, so I'll use this one as my Tower of Babel image for the rest of the talk. Well, I first became aware of the existence of a Tower of Babel problem in work I began decades ago on empirical issues with respect to altruism. Where does it exist? What influences altruism and so on? There's a large literature there. Well, in the philosophical literature by now, although not so much back then, in the philosophical literature on altruism, the distinction between psychological and evolutionary interpretations of altruism is now widely recognized, largely as a result of Elliot Sober and David Sloan Wilson's book in their 1998 Unto Others. Crucially important point that Elliot and David make is that psychological altruism and evolutionary altruism are dramatically different, and you can't conclude from evolutionary altruism that psychological altruism is true or vice versa. They're simply different phenomena, and when a researcher doesn't tell us what he or she has in mind, whether it's psychological or evolutionary altruism, we often get a Tower of Babel problem where you're defending psychological altruism and I'm attacking evolutionary altruism. So the problem arises, used to arise very dramatically back in the 70s and 80s. That particular ambiguity was diminished by the Unto Others book. But in the social sciences, right up to the present, the term altruism is used in a bewildering variety of ways. And these two researchers, and I'm glad I'm here with this audience because I'm not going to try to pronounce their names. Can a native French speaker please tell me how they're pronounced? Particularly Michel. How is his last name pronounced? Help! There are native French speakers here, right? Clavienne and Chapuisat. Okay, but in any event, these two, I think they're at least located in Switzerland at the moment. But in a really very nice 2013 review of the literature, they looked at the literature in experimental economics, in evolutionary anthropology, and in evolutionary game theory. And they note with more than a bit of understatement that the nature of the altruism implicated in these studies is not fully clear, to put it mildly. In light of this bristling diversity, Clavienne and Chapuisat lament that, and I love this quote, so I'll read it to you in its full. The notion of altruism has become so plastic that it's often hard to understand what is really meant by authors using the term. And it's even harder to evaluate the degree to which results from one research field, for example, experimental economics, may facilitate the resolution of debates in another research field, for example, evolutionary biology or philosophy. Well, one important implication of the Tower of Babel problem is that the literature on altruism, in the literature on altruism, is that the question, which one of these phenomena is really altruism, just makes no sense, okay? And I want to stress this because I'm going to move away from the talk is not about altruism at all. I'm just laying the groundwork here. I'm going to come back to this conclusion when you've got a bristling Tower of Babel problem, and then you ask, well, which one of these is the real altruism? Makes no sense at all. People are simply using one word to talk about importantly different, indeed dramatically different phenomena, okay? All right. Well, the existence of a Tower of Babel problem in the large literature on altruism is by now reasonably well documented. But it's my contention, and this is the central thesis of the talk, it's my contention that there's an equally serious and largely unrecognized Tower of Babel problem in the literature in the cognitive science of moral judgment. So this is really my theme slide. That's what I'm going to try to convince you of. Although, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has written about it or noticed it. There's a huge Tower of Babel problem in the cognitive science of moral judgment. Well, since the literature is enormous, how many thousands? What, 90? How many? No. How many citations can I say? The literature is enormous. The full story about this Tower of Babel problem is long and complicated. And since time is limited, I'm going to focus on one of the most important and widely known disputes. Okay. There are many researchers involved in these disputes, but the two central figures are Elliot Turiel and John Haidt. And I'm going to assume, as I would if I were giving this talk in the States, at least in a different kind of audience, everybody knows John Haidt. He's become a media figure by now. But many of you, how many of you know the work of Elliott Turiel? That's what I was guessing. Okay, good. So let me tell you a little bit about Elliott Turiel. Turiel was a student of Lawrence Kohlberg's. There's Kohlberg. And Kohlberg, in turn, was influenced by Jean Piaget. You'll see the slide again in a minute. Both Piaget and Kohlberg were advocates of what Turiel calls the differentiation model. This maintains that moral reasoning emerges through its differentiation from non-moral processes. In young children, convention and morality are presumed to be undifferentiated on this Piaget and Kohlberg view, while in older children, the two are differentiated. Turiel was, from the very beginning of his career, so this was very early work, Turiel was skeptical. So by the way, he's rebelling against the master. He was Kohlberg's student. But he was skeptical of the claim that there's only one sort of normative cognition in young children. He was convinced that moral cognition is distinct from cognition about social conventions, and that the distinction is present quite early in development. Well, in order to test or to defend this claim, Turiel needed an empirical test that would indicate whether a normative judgment made by experimental participants, including very young participants, because he's concerned with the age at which this distinction emerges, he needed a test that would tell us whether experimental participants' judgments were moral judgments or judgments about a conventional matter. And interestingly, and outside of very small circles, this isn't widely known, I think. But in constructing his test, Turiel actually focused on a very large philosophical literature on the definition of morality that had emerged beginning in the 1950s. That literature has, unfortunately, I think, largely disappeared from the philosophical curriculum. But from 1950 through 1980, it generated literally hundreds of papers, including some from leading figures in the field. This is a useful 1970s anthology and a very partial list of some of the major figures who were contributing to this literature in that volume. Well, the philosophers who contributed to this large literature disagreed. They disagreed on, as best I can tell, just about everything. And after a third of a century of vigorous philosophical debate, they reached no consensus on anything. Well, if you'd like a recent and somewhat less flippant overview of this literature, let me put in a plug for my Boundaries of Morality paper, which you can find on my website. Okay? Well, Turiel's test incorporated several features, each of which had been proposed by a number of philosophers in the literature I just alluded to as necessary features of moral judgment, and of course disputed by other philosophers in that literature. One of the ones that Turiel adopted was what he called universality. Moral prescriptions, he tells us, are universally applicable. They apply to everyone in similar circumstances. So if a young participant judges that it would be wrong for a child in her school to push someone off a swing, and if that judgment is a moral judgment, we should expect the participant to judge that it's wrong for a child in a different school, maybe in a different place, to push someone off a swing under similar circumstances. We should also expect the participant to judge that the same action would be wrong if it happened at some time in the past or sometime in the future. So that's one of the criteria Turiel built into his test. Another was what gets called authority independence. As Turiel construed it, it required that if an action is morally wrong, it would still be morally wrong if there were no explicit rules against it, or it would still be morally wrong even if some recognized authority, the school principal or headmistress or the teacher of the class, said it wasn't prohibited. So, since Turiel thought that young children could distinguish transgressions of moral rules from transgressions of conventional rules, he, of course, also needed an empirical test that would indicate that a participant considers an action to be a transgression of a conventional rule. And here again, he consulted the philosophical literature. So there is this interesting, rich synergy going on. This is in the 60s and 70s when this empirical literature was just emerging between the philosophy and the psychology. Synergy may not be the right word, since Turiel may well be misreading almost every philosopher he consults, but that's another problem. Okay. Well, relying on his interpretation of his Berkeley colleague, John Searle, he claimed that if a participant took an action that would be a transgression of a conventional rule, she won't insist that the same action would be wrong at other times and other places. So it's not universalizing. And she won't think that the rule, she will think that the rule might be altered by a suitably authoritative person or group. So it's not authority independent. Well, using those putative features of moral and conventional judgments, Turiel constructed an empirical test to determine whether an experimental participant's judgment about a transgression is a moral judgment or a conventional judgment. The test has 4 steps. First step is to simply provide an age-appropriate vignette, a short story describing the hypothetical transgression. Then the participant is asked, so this is step 2, whether she thinks the transgression was wrong. And importantly, words like, is this morally wrong or wrong indeed at all, aren't used. Participant is typically asked, well, is this okay or is this not okay? So that's step 2. Step 3, the participant is asked age-appropriate questions about whether the transgression would generalize in space and time. Asked questions like, would this be okay in a distant town, or would this be okay in France? Okay, or would this be okay different times when your grandparents were kids? And they're also asked whether it's authority independent. Would it be okay if the principal of the school said there was no rule against it? Well, that experimental procedure that I just described for you, which by the way has by now been used hundreds at least, I have a bibliography that's hundreds of, maybe even thousands of times, that experimental procedure is going to play a very important role in the argument that follows. So I think we should give it a distinctive label. Turiel and his collaborators refer to answers to the questions asked in the procedure as criterion judgments. Don't ask why. You really don't want to know. And you're never going to find out from me because I've never figured it out. But in any event, I propose to use the label the Turiel criterion judgment test. That's just the 4-step test for whether something is a moral judgment or a conventional one. Well, starting in the mid-1970s, Turiel and his colleagues used versions of the Turiel criterion judgment task with a variety of participant groups. This work used transgressions that Turiel and his colleagues took to be obviously or intuitively moral, like one child pushing another child off a swing in the playground because he wanted to use it himself. And transgressions that took to be obviously or intuitively conventional, like the example that's always quoted, wearing pajamas to school, okay? The results of these experiments using the Turiel task clearly confirmed Turiel's prediction. Transgressions that Turiel and colleagues took to be obviously moral, like one kid pushing another kid off the swing because he wants to use the swing himself, were typically judged to be wrong, to be authority independent, and to generalize to other places and other times. Transgressions that Turiel and colleagues judged to be obviously conventional, like wearing pajamas to school, were typically judged to be wrong, authority dependent, and not generalized to other times and places. And those distinctions emerged very early in development. Remember, Turiel's main target here is Kohlberg and Piaget. Very early in development, by their 4th birthday and often earlier, kids had systematically different reactions to the transgression used. Well, this was an overwhelming victory for Turiel in his disagreement with Piaget. It's just not the case that young children think of all normative rules in the same way. Their normative cognition isn't undifferentiated. Normative cognition in young children is much more subtle, more varied, and more complex than Kohlberg and Piaget had portrayed it. It was a major achievement in the study of child development, so I couldn't resist putting that slide together. Turiel wins that one, and Piaget and Kohlberg lose. But I hear you cry, particularly those of you who follow his many web pages. What about John Haidt's work? Tell us. Sorry, but before focusing on that, I need some more background. I need to put a bit more background in place. How many minutes have I been talking? This is the halfway point.
40, 50 minutes.
I've been talking for 40.
Oh, how long have you been talking? Approximately 30 minutes.
Excellent. Then I'm just sort of where I wanted to be. All right. In the work of Turiel and his colleagues, there are many, often lengthy discussions of the definition of morality. And as we'll soon see, these definitions are very controversial, and they're also very puzzling. Since, first of all, it's not exactly clear what they say, the language they use is often very hard to interpret. And it's not clear what their status is or what role they play in the research of Turiel and his collaborators. And his critics, like Haidt, often get this screamingly wrong. So at one point, John claims that Turiel's definitions are stipulative. But this is just clearly mistaken, since Turiel, along with Schrader and Much, have written, the meaning of morality is something to be, of the term morality, is something to be discovered, not stipulated, okay? So this is clearly something he's committed to, although what the heck he's claiming here or what he's thinking is going on is not at all clear. Why do Turiel and colleagues think that the meaning of morality is something to be discovered? Well, here's another bad idea, not attributed to Haidt, by the way. One idea is that they sought to discover the meaning of the ordinary English term morality and moral, or other terms in closely related language. But that, again, is clearly not what they're doing. That's clearly a mistaken claim. And the evidence for that is in this quote. Turiel tells us that the terminology doesn't necessarily respond to general non-social scientific uses of the labels convention and morality, that sometimes ordinary usage corresponds to his definitions, sometimes it doesn't. So that's not what's going on. I think I have an account of what's going on. I'm not going to belabor it, but in collaboration with Edward Marshally, I've argued that the best interpretation is that, having first constructed the Turiel judgment task, okay, and shown that it reliably identifies many judgments that are intuitively moral and many that are intuitively conventional, then the proposed definitions of morality are attempts to characterize the full class of judgments that the test classifies as moral. That's sort of a mouthful, so let me give you a diagram. Can I? Yes, here. So here's the Turiel criterion judgment task, remember. It classifies presumably an open-ended, huge, maybe even infinite class of judgments as moral judgments. What the definition is trying to do is to try to give a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for a judgment being in that class. So the definition is trying to capture what the criterion judgment task is picking out. If you want a defense of that view, which is both reasonably new and certainly controversial, the recently published moral conventional distinction article in the Stanford Encyclopedia that Edward and I wrote will give you the account of that. Although, let me warn you, truth in advertising, the working title of this paper, as we worked on it for 3 years or something of the sort, was More Than You Ever Wanted to Know About the Moral Convention Distinction. Well, as you might expect, this account, these definitions of morality evolved over the years as new things were discovered. The earliest definitions identified moral transgressions as transgressions that violated principles of justice. Somewhat later, in Turiel's 83 book, a very frequently quoted passage occurs. He says that the moral domain refers to prescriptive judgments of justice, rights, and welfare pertaining to how people ought to relate to each other. And the surrounding text makes it clear that the central element in his conception of welfare is the avoidance of harm. All right, finally, we're back to John Haidt, okay? So it's these definitions of morality that are at the center of Haidt's critique of Turiel's work, and not just Turiel's work, but here's what he says about Turiel. He says, the problems with those definitions of conventional morality is that they don't travel well. Moreover, on Haidt's view, the problem isn't just restricted to Turiel and his collaborators. This is one of my favorite quotes from John Haidt's work. He says, the psychological study of morality has been dominated by politically liberal researchers. By the way, the part I've left out there is a parenthesis that says, including me. Right? So at this time, he considered himself, maybe he still does, a politically liberal researcher. The lack of moral and political diversity amongst researchers has led to an inappropriate narrowing of the moral domain to issues of harm and care and fairness, reciprocity, and justice. The quote goes on, morality in most cultures, and for social conservatives in Western cultures, is in fact much broader, including issues of in-group loyalty, authority, respect, purity, sanctity. Well, that's a mouthful. To understand, I think, what's really going on here, we're going to have to go back a few decades and take a look at some of the important work of John Haidt's postdoc supervisor, Rick Schrader. Schrader was an early critic of Turiel's definitions of morality. And what he claimed was that in many non-Western societies, many transgressions that don't involve harm or justice or rights are classified as moral. And that the class of transgressions that's classified as conventional is vanishingly small. So Rick Schrader is famous for saying, in many non-Western cultures, all wrongness judgments are moral judgments. Nothing is conventional in these, Rick tends to be quite flowery and overstate things. I've learned that from him. But that's what he said. Well, to support his claim, he did an elaborate study, a very famous study, actually, comparing judgments of participants in Chicago with those of Orthodox Hindu participants in the Indian city of Bhubaneswar. If, like me, you had to look it up, there's where Bhubaneswar is. Using his own test, so Schrader used his own test for telling moral from conventional judgments. He found that a number of transgressions that the Indians took to be moral, the Americans didn't. And I have to ask again here because this is terra incognito for me. How many of you know this work? Wow. I feel like I'm, okay, really important, interesting work that's been widely discussed and central to Haidt's critique. Two of the famous examples that Turiel used in this work were the day after his father's death, the eldest son had a haircut and ate chicken. And a widow in your community eats fish 2 or 3 times a week. Okay, and then he used this long test for moral judgments, which I'll come back to in a bit. But not surprisingly, using Schrader's test, the Americans, the children and adults in Chicago, judged these to be not wrong at all. What's wrong with eating fish? Okay. The Indians judged them to be moral transgressions, indeed, quite serious moral transgressions. Schrader's conclusion was, look, these completely harmless things are considered to be moral transgressions in Bhubaneswar. Turiel's definition doesn't travel well. Bad news, though, for Schrader. Turiel and colleagues very quickly pointed out that the Indian participants also had important factual beliefs that the Americans didn't, and that explained the difference. What factual beliefs? Well, they believed that the son's behavior, eating chicken shortly after the father died, would prevent the father's soul from receiving salvation. Serious transgression, right? And that the widow's fish eating might lead her to have sex, which would lead her husband's spirit to suffer. Okay, so the Indians believed that the son's and the widow's behavior was harmful, and the Americans didn't. And the critics of Schrader, Turiel, and others said, this doesn't show that the definition doesn't travel well. These people take these acts to be harmful. All right, now I can get you to what I tried to lure you in with by saying I was going to tell you about John Haidt, who's on television all the time and is really good looking, right? So John Haidt to the rescue. In the early 1990s, this was shortly after he had been a postdoc, actually when he was a postdoc with Rick Schrader, Haidt designed a study aimed at providing a better test of Schrader's critique of Turiel. To do this, he looked at people's judgments of what he, Haidt, took to be harmless taboo violations, but mindful of the problem that Schrader got into. To be sure the participants really regarded the transgressions as harmless, he did the obvious thing. He asked them, is anybody harmed by this? Okay, so he knew that they viewed them as harmless. Haidt's examples are very well known by now. Maybe not. So as you can see, this was written for a slightly different audience. But I said, some of them are just too much fun to pass over without reminding you. So let me either remind you or inform you of the two that everybody talks about. Number one, eating the family. He doesn't call it, this is my label. People are given this vignette. A family's dog was killed by a car in front of their house. They had heard dog meat, it was delicious. So they cut up the dog's body and cooked it and ate it for dinner. I've got a large set of pictures, okay. And number two, the really famous one, sex before dinner. A man goes to the supermarket once a week and buys a dead chicken. But before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. John, by the way, loves this cartoon. It appeared in Slate magazine shortly after the article appeared. Well, famously in this study, using a truncated version of Schrader's test, Haidt found that Brazilians in the poor, less westernized city of Recife and low socioeconomic status Americans tend to regard transgressions like these as moral transgressions, even though they explicitly state that nobody is harmed. So it was this work that Haidt used to support his claim that Schrader was right. Turiel's definitions do not travel well, right? These are clearly not considered to be harmful by the participants, and yet they judge them to be morally wrong. All right. Well, remember this was about the Tower of Babel problem. It's drifted into the background. It's about to reemerge. And I'm 3/4 done, by the way, 100 slides. But if you've been paying very careful attention, and I hope you haven't, I've done my best to conceal it because I wanted to pull the rabbit out of the hat. You will have noted that there's a Tower of Babel problem in the work I've just cited. Why? Well, in an earlier slide, I noted, but didn't say much about the fact that in his critique of Turiel, Schrader used his own test for distinguishing moral from conventional transgressions. There's the slide where I noticed it, so in case you're doubting that I told you. But Schrader's test and the Turiel criterion judgment test are very different. The crucial questions, remember, in Turiel's criterion judgment test was, does the transgression generalize in time and space? Is the transgression authority independent? That's the Turiel criterion judgment test, on the basis of which he classifies judgments as moral judgments or conventional judgments. Here's Schrader's test. Okay. Notice that it includes features that are not mentioned in Turiel's criterion judgment test: seriousness, sin, secrecy, privacy, punishment. And it includes features that Turiel and his colleagues explicitly disavow as features of moral judgments as they understand them. Seriousness disavowed. Here's a passage by Judith Smetana, one of Turiel's frequent collaborators, where she says, the severity doesn't count in determining whether it's a moral or a conventional transgression. Punishment. Here's another quote from Smetana and colleagues where she says, punishment doesn't count either. Also, Schrader's test doesn't include any clear and specific question about generality in time or about authority independence. I also noted earlier that Haidt had used a truncated version of Schrader's test. There's the slide where I told you that. Here's Haidt's test. Okay. Notice some things about the test. These are quite similar to items on Schrader's test. These have no analogs in Schrader's test. There's no clear and specific question about generality in space and time, crucial for Turiel. And there's no question about authority independence, which is the other part that's crucial for Turiel. So, conclusion I want to draw here is that Haidt's test is notably different from Schrader's and very different from the Turiel criterion judgment test. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there's never been an empirical study of the extent to which Schrader's test, Haidt's test, and the Turiel criterion judgment test result in the same classification of people's judgments. But I think it's overwhelmingly plausible that the three tests would differ substantially in the utterances that they would classify as moral judgments. Schrader requires all sorts of things that Turiel explicitly rejects, right? And Turiel requires things that Schrader and Haidt specifically don't include. Well, if that's right, then we have our first illustration of a Tower of Babel problem for the psychology of moral judgment. Why? Well, even if Haidt's study is otherwise completely unproblematic, there was going to be a cutesy footnote here, but I erased, but I'll put it isn't. But anyhow, even if it were completely unproblematic, he hasn't shown that Brazilians in Recife and low socioeconomic status participants in Philadelphia judge that harmless taboo violations are morally wrong using Turiel's criterion judgment test to identify moral judgments. He's shown they were morally wrong using a dramatically different test. So Haidt and Turiel are simply arguing at cross purposes. Turiel is saying, by my test, these are judged to be not morally wrong. Morally wrong. Haidt's test said they're not. Okay, they're using moral judgment with different meanings and almost certainly different extensions. And there's the cartoon that I told you I liked. I'm not sure which one's Haidt and which one is Turiel. Okay, well, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So the big project that I'm working on, the book that maybe one day will be finished, fills out the rest of the iceberg. Let me spend just 2 or 3 minutes telling you about the rest of the iceberg. Dozens of other researchers, indeed it may be by now hundreds of other researchers, have used a wide variety of what I like to call Turiel style strategies, which borrow ideas from Turiel in specifying what they take to be necessary features of moral judgments, but they differ dramatically from Turiel's criterion judgment test. And rather than give you examples, here's a slide I put together. All of these people, and it's far from an exhaustive list, all of these people use Turiel-inspired criteria, but they're, except for the Turiel people across the top, they're all different. Okay, so there are heaps and gobs of these in the literature. But that's just the beginning of the iceberg. Those are just the people who are sympathetic to Turiel's general approach. There are also dozens, maybe hundreds of other researchers who use ordinary language strategies that simply ask the participant whether the judgment was moral or some other locution in ordinary English. Was it a moral judgment? Was it morally bad? Was it morally wrong? Or related locutions in ordinary English that don't use the word moral. Here are 4 of the most well-known and important of them, but I could also have given you a slide with 20 or 30 or 40 more people on it. And that's not the end of the iceberg. Another large group of researchers have used intuitive strategies, relying on the researcher's intuition to determine whether a participant's judgment was that a moral judgment? We're not going to use a test at all. I just judge intuitively. That's obviously they're making moral judgments. Here are 3 people who have done that, but again, I could have given you 10 more, okay? Well, in an earlier slide, we're getting toward the end. Be of good cheer, we're almost done. In an earlier slide, I claimed that there's a serious and largely unrecognized Tower of Babel problem in the literature and the cognitive science of moral judgment. That's my main thesis for this talk, and I trust I've now made a plausible case for that claim. These people are using different criteria without noticing that they're using different criteria, and they can't be seriously assuming that all these tests pick out the same things because they screamingly don't, okay? Well, in the short time that remains, I want to ask a sort of beyond the over-the-horizon question. What should we make of this situation that in these 900,000 papers on the cognitive science of moral judgment, there's a screaming Tower of Babel problem? What should we make of that situation? The answer is there are lots of possible responses. So at this point, I've tried to be sort of careful, or at least careful by Stich standards up till now. I'm going to stop trying to be careful at all from here on. I fully acknowledge there are lots of different ways of reacting to the phenomenon I've shown you. I just want to finish up by mentioning one. It's the one I'll call the radical response, or moral judgment eliminativism, okay? And I'll invite you to give me other responses, but here's how the response goes in 3 or 4 slides. The radical response is simply to give up on the idea that moral judgment, that term used by researchers in moral psychology and the cognitive science of moral judgment, to give up on the idea that that term is a useful theoretical term in cognitive science. So the radical response urges that cognitive scientists should stop talking about moral judgments because it's not a useful theoretical term in their science. And it's not a useful theoretical term in neighboring disciplines like neuroscience or evolutionary biology. And perhaps it's not a useful term in philosophy either. And to recognize that researchers who use different strategies for identifying moral judgments are often studying importantly different phenomena. So that's what I'm urging. One response to discovering the Tower of Babel problem in this literature would be recognize that people are really studying dramatically different things. Which one of these is really moral judgment? Well, you may remember I laid the ground for this right at the beginning by talking about which one is really altruism. Is it evolutionary altruism or psychological altruism? And there are, of course, 42 different kinds of evolutionary altruism and at least 9 kinds of psychological. Which one of those is really altruism? The answer here is the same as the answer about altruism. The question doesn't make any sense. And remember, most of you looked like you were agreeing with me about altruism. Maybe you don't want to agree with me here. Well, one intentionally provocative way of articulating this radical response is, hey, there is no such thing as moral judgment. The term moral judgment doesn't pick out anything systematically at all. We ought to give up on the term and study moral cognition in a different way. So that's my radical conclusion. Okay. Well, this is the topic where I was guessing from Mario's email that Mario would be reluctant to go all the way down. Okay. But since I'm, as I told you earlier, less prudent than Mario, I'm inclined to follow the naturalistic argument all the way down and conclude that there is no such thing as moral judgment. Psychologists should stop trying to study it. And if they want to keep the term, subscript it. Subscripts are very cheap, right? And there are endlessly many of them. So you can have 116 different moral judgment ish. Well, which one is really moral judgment? And the question makes no sense. There's no good answer to that question. That's the end of my talk, but don't applaud yet because I want to say, well, you might not want to applaud. I want to say one more thing. Before ending the talk, we've been acknowledging for the last 2 days Mario's extraordinary contribution to many different areas of philosophy. But I thought, particularly since I have this treasure trove of photographs, you may wonder, where did I get these photographs? He sends me Christmas cards. So I've got 20 years worth of Christmas cards. So I wanted to acknowledge what Mario surely does, and if he doesn't, he ought to consider his greatest accomplishment. There is Mario's greatest accomplishment. So, thanks.